Thank you so much, yeah, for having me. Big thanks to James and Elizabeth and Known Unknown for having me over here for just my type. I'm really excited also to, of course, hear what Philip has been up to. Okay, so I'm gonna give you my talk. All right, I'm Kiel D. Mutschelknaus. The D is for danger. And just my type, I guess I've been trying to think about what that means for me and my work. And we'll get to that, soon eventually. But I'll give a quick recap of kind of the approach I'm coming from, where I'm coming from. So my work primarily focuses around motion and generative work. My recent studio has a great deal to do with working with code, right? So I work a lot with processing and P5.js. And I've been trying to automate a lot of the work I've done and so I can learn motion graphics and learn coding. So sometimes it's exploring depth and space, like the piece you see on the right there. Other times it's automating motion, like the piece you see on the left, like maybe something we would be doing in After Effects and trying to see what it would look like if we could automate that, recreate it in code, make it a little bit more generative, or being able to manipulate it on the fly. It kind of came from a kind of a hiccup I had in my own practice where some of the tools I was using, the Adobe Creative Cloud, were kind of slowing me down. And even though I knew kind of exactly what I wanted, the process through going to achieve that was kind of taking too long. And what I needed was a space where I could automate the whole thing. I felt like I kind of uh, knew the routes I needed to go through, knew the actions I needed to perform, but was running into this barrier where I couldn't do it as quickly as I knew computers could. So then I jumped into processing in P5, and that's where a lot of my work resides right now. So sometimes it's exploring specific things, one-off elements. Other times it's exploring very distinct, specific aesthetics. So like this element on the left is trying to replicate a glass texture without using real 3D effects or any sort of materials, but instead thinking more about like, what is it really going on when we see a glass distortion like that, or a slightly unregistered VHS or something like that. So that's a real simple exercise in mapping onto a surface a slightly offset UV map, So I'm drawing the type in one space and then in P5 drawing that and mapping it to slightly offset shapes. And then the one on the right is, kind of my take on more of a motion graphics exercise. Is it possible to create something that feels very bespoke and custom and intentional inside of kind of a random context? So that is just type set out, but then each type has a series of deformers that may be randomly applied to them and offset and played. And there's some great acceleration in there, some fun acceleration formulas to give it the sense that it's a very bespoke custom motion, when in fact it's just kind of going through a huge set of different animations that it could be creating. And as I've documented this kind of on my journey, it's opened up a lot of really fun opportunities. Here's a editorial illustration. A lot of these have led to editorial illustrations. So here's one for the New Yorker digital issue cover, this series of interviews, where it was something I had been working with, just for fun on my social media and posting some exercises I did about trying to make a strip of graphics feel as though it was wrapping into itself and that it was kind of a seamless knot, and how to make that but still allow, have mathematics and formula involved so that I could get it just precise and just right. And this is something that, we could probably create in Cinema 4D or Blender or some sort of 3D program. But could it also be done in processing? So what you see on the left is this kind of layout tool I created specifically in processing, and then created the composition, got everything just right, and then rendered out a series of frames. It's, perfectly based on a rotating loop. Also, the offset of the type is moving as well, so that also had to be kind of figured out, the timing of that. to make it a perfect loop. So then rendering out every single frame and then doing some post-production inside of After Effects to kind of clean it up as well. So that's a fun way in which, again, making my own tools, making a very kind of specific compositional structure to work in to get the composition right, and then having it lead to this final static linear motion sort of piece for the New Yorker. More recently, this is a piece I did just a couple months ago for Columbia Engineering. And the illustrations on the right are, some of the elements we used, kind of that Point 5, this agency I worked with, used throughout the website. But some of those layouts and stuff were done in After Effects, but I was using expressions to kind of place all of these rather than having to do them individually. I was placing them through code that I had actually been experimenting with years earlier in some cases. So that piece on the left is this giant wave wall, like if you think of that planet on Interstellar that they land on, that they don't realize that big wave is it's a wave and not a mountain, if you'll remember that scene. So some of the exponential curves that I learned in that exercise lent themselves really beautifully to what I did for Columbia Engineering on the right for one of their websites. That had to do a lot about digital, elements and security and stuff. I also, have been doing some illustrations that are a little less type driven and more illustrative. So these still staying on the science tech angle. These are a few illustrations with an agency called Bunsen that they focus very heavily on science and tech driven communities. And so these both have to do with biology, cells, and culture. And so still both of them have their kind of genesis inside of processing and coding. The pieces on the right are P5.js so that they live very beautifully to be interacted with. And then the one on the left, I believe, is just in processing, trying to figure out how to get a constantly looping. And the loop here is actually a pretty elegant loop, I think, anyway, where you've got these marching kind of cells coming out from the middle. That, along with some After Effects post-processing. So that's a little bit about how code has found its way into my studio practice. But also some of these have found their way online. So spacetypegenerator.com is a project I've been working on for a few years now. And every time I do one of these experiments or exercises, and they kind of become incredibly fun to play with, they're all fun to play with, but some of them are very linear, very, very focused in nature. And to be honest, there's not much experimentation to do with them, but some of them are very open and can be very open to like different compositions and structures. So some of the recent ones that I think embody this are the spacetypegenerator.com badge, which you see on the right, where it's that's the most layered complex generator I've created. It's generators and generators and generators. It's pretty crazy, and I've always wanted to revisit it, but it kind of scares me, to be honest, kind of the sheer amount of potential in that one. But again, I would love to kind of return to that one. Or, you can play with physics with the one on the left that is crash, spacetypegenerator.com/crash. And that one, you can swap out the type and create these physics bounds and then throw all your type around. You can record yourself interacting with it. And that's been a fun recent project to interact with. Okay, so when I've been thinking about just my type, kind of my approach to some of the work, I wanted to go back a little bit, like looking at like the pieces, the typography pieces that have been most personable to me, I think, most my type rather than just kind of general, design approaches. I wouldn't consider myself an artist by any means. I am a designer, but if I did have to think about some pieces that are most specifically Kiel or my style or close to me and like kind of have some sort of special meaning, I did pick out a few that I wanted to talk through to give you a little bit more kind of behind the scenes of where they came from. So just as an idea, when I very first started designing, I was very much an illustrator. I came to it from an illustrative approach, was huge into just drawing. I didn't really I think, know what graphic design was. I just thought you drew a cool picture and then you, at the last moment, threw some type on it. And so when I started really actually understanding graphic design and getting into it, I brought some of those some of that with me. So here's some very first sketches. I made sure I put the date here, 2011. So, over 10 years ago. This was my first kind of approach to typography, where these very intense Gothic script, and it's borderline illegible. But I was at Cranbrook, and that's just what you do at Cranbrook, is you make things illegible. And then, so that was like a seed that was planted, and then years later, I was kind of, I think, the same seed that lent itself to my first real coding project, which was Mercurial Black, which was that same sort of Gothic script, but now split up into modular pieces, each with its own slider, where you could create a pretty robust range of different type forms using some very basic rules. And I think it's still available on plm.land if any of you all want to try it out. But when I look back on like the very illustrative approach that I had in the beginning to where it landed, I do see kind of the seeds in the beginning there kind of landing here as well. Another seed was planted even further back. This was a type piece I did when I was a designer in South Dakota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, working in advertising. One of the first kind of illustration pieces I did with type, along with that other Detroit piece, was this piece where I was like, doing very intense vector drawings. So this is danger. Again, maybe this is like the first real danger connection. I don't know. Maybe this is my origin story. Uh, where I like was in Illustrator, kind of very fine tuned, very like delicately, very intensely zooming into 16,000% or 1,600%, right? Like laying down all these vector points to try and get this very fine, delicate feeling. And then now when I look back 10 years after that, I see a very clear line between those sort of animations and the danger generator that I created a few years ago, where rather than do it with vector points individually, laying out each one specifically, I instead did some more UV mapping, where I took the type, cut it into grids. This is a very kind of classic processing approach, is to take something you draw, cut it up into a very intense grid, and then offset those grids with a noise wave, a Perlin noise wave, to kind of give it this liquidy flowing effect. And so, I mean, when I put those two dangers beside themselves, I mean, there's pretty, feels very clear, that line. Okay, so that brings me to the one I really want to dive into, which is a generator I released, yeah, just a couple of months ago. POW, I think, space type, POW, crash, all these things are kind of already cluttering my own mind. Maybe that's an age thing. Okay, so just my type. I would consider this right now to be kind of just my type, and kind of encapsulate a lot of my approach, my thought to a type that's very kind of core to my own personhood, I guess. And this piece kind of came out of a place where I was doing lots of work that felt very math driven, right? Very formulaic, very generative. I think one of my main beefs with generative work is that can be so ambient, right? It's a lot of waves, a lot of kind of looping motion that starts to feel a little bit, just like you're chilling out and vibing to it. And there's no real compositional point of view or very characteristic approaches. It just kind of feels like a sine wave over and over. And not that those are beautiful. I love that. I'm all about that sine wave action. But I think for this project, I was, challenging myself, like, could I make it a little bit more? Could I make something that was coded look hand done? Could I make something that was code through code, make it look a little bit more illustrative, a little bit more like some of the earlier work that I did myself? And so this is another piece I did also, 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. It's a little bit scary looking at all this, so I apologize if you see me shivering. So I did a bunch of these vector drawings. Again, I was huge into illustration and vectors. And so these are a bunch of, this is like this cartoon cloud of conflict with all of these weapons and people fighting. And there's a sledgehammer and there's an axe and a knife, along with some religious imagery, because again, I was at Cranbrook. And so all these things coming together, I was really into this cloud. And so, now 10 years later, I'm thinking about those clouds again. Like, how could I take that same sort of approach, but rather than it being so distinct and hand drawn, like, could I automate some of this process? Could I make it generative? So here's some like early sketches and thinking about like if I needed to make it in code, what does that look like? And so I took a cloud and started to think about like what the Bezier pass would require, how we could take some of that stuff that feels kind of goopy and done in ink and a little bit looser, but make it a little bit um, more of a Bezier path, right? So these are some early schematics, and what I settled on was coming up with a perimeter, finding points along that perimeter, and then drawing out from there handle points. And that's like a very clear, classic Bezier solution, Bezier path solution. And so here was some of those first conflict clouds, again with the type inside of it, because I really loved that overlap. And as I was working on this, it started to look really interesting the way in which I was able to, which it was kind of peeking through some type. So these are some drawings I did in Illustrator where I was taking some of those same bumpy forms and playing around with overlap, seeing if they could like somehow sneak into the typography. So the earlier clouds, I was thinking, could we merge those with an actual type form? And then really loving kind of the color and overlap that could occur between them. So bringing it into code here, how can we achieve something like this? In those earlier ones, I just figured out a circle, just like plotting around points around a circle and then pushing out more Bezier paths through there. But type is quite a bit different. Type is quite a bit more intense. But luckily for us, P5 has text or text points from text. You can grab a bunch of points along any sort of typeface that you drop in here. So I was able to kind of scatter these points along. But one thing I really liked about that earlier drawing was that it wasn't just this, but then like bumps all the way around it, right? Like there's some of the type peeks through by having flat forms. So I wrote this algorithm that would go through and it would grab some of these points and it would make some of them, group some of them as kind of individual points, but then also keep some of the linear points. So here, the magenta ones are actually straight paths and yellows were the ones that I picked every few points along this text of points. It would skip along. And that's where I was imagining the bumps to be formed for Bezier paths to kind of peek out from those yellow points. And here I'm playing around with the sliders to kind of show the ability to change that ratio and then to also manipulate how far apart those yellow points were by how fine I wanted those clouds versus how far apart I wanted them. And then we needed to add the Bezier paths. So here I'm along each one of those. Now I switch the colors, bad designer. Switch the colors there. So now along each one of those points that is a bump, I picked out a point that was tangent to wherever you clicked with the mouse. So you can see it kind of extends out from there. And then if you remember that kind of earlier sketch I showed, you can start to imagine like what it would, if each one of those was the Bezier handle that was connecting it. And from there, I added some acceleration so you get a little bit more of kind of acceleration, but then also offset that acceleration so it feel like it ripples through the whole thing. And this was by like detecting that one point, finding out where it would end, and then kind of just gradually interpolating between those points. And then loop that all together, and this is kind of what you get. So you see a little bit of a debug mode here, where along those yellow points now is kind of the flat surfaces, where the other points, I guess they're maybe cyan here is where you see the jumps. And then the red things are those Bezier handles that are, again, tangent to wherever you click. So that's kind of setting up the origin point. I'm almost done here. A couple other like little kind of nuances that I found really exciting while working on this was the ability to detect where the mouse is clicked, obviously to set up the tangent points, but also if you look closely, like that also determines the order in which it's drawn. So as you see the mouse as it clicks over the A will be drawn over top of the B and the C. If you click on the B will cover it up so that there's a good sense of overlap so that it doesn't feel like the explosions, since they're blooming in a certain direction, are going underneath or over in the wrong direction. And because the sketch is actually two-dimensional, I had to change the order in which they're drawn to get that sense of overlap, which I think is a very kind of a small thing, but also I think has bigger repercussions. And it's kind of exciting when you have a bigger set like this, where all the type does need to feel as if you can see the origin point and that becomes the top point that's drawn. So here's kind of what the final one started to look like when you added more type, more layers, and then lots of different features, colors, strokes. There's also a pop of the mouse that kind of gives you a bit better sense of interaction and where the origin point is. And at the end of the day, I think, playing around with the sliders, I do think you can get kind of the sense that it's less coded and maybe a little bit more illustrative. And then one last little thing here is after I released it, I kind of realized what happens if I took those points and I inverted them, took those Bezier paths, and rather than them bulging out, what if they became a little bit more edgier, a little bit more sharp. And so here I did away with the flat elements inside of the type and instead just had those Bezier points pull out. And so this combination, what is the point there? I don't know if it's the point flying out and then the handle is being pulled in, or if it's just a handle shooting straight out. Maybe this handle's shooting straight out between it. Regardless, I guess I'd have to get back in the code and take a look at how that's actually being created. But if you imagine some of those Bezier points being kind of inverted, the handle's going the other way, you get a kind of a sense of how that same sort of structure and same sort of approach of sampling all these points and then accelerating out the handles could give you this sort of effect. All right, that's just my type.